Here's a question that should bother you more than it probably does. What is actually backing the US dollar right now? Most people will say the American economy. Some will say military strength. A few will say confidence and trust. And they're not entirely wrong, but they're also not getting to the real answer. Because one of the key foundations of the dollar's dominance, the thing that has allowed the United States to borrow and spend and live beyond its means for half a century, is a quiet strategic arrangement built with major oil producers in the 1970s, one that was never voted on, never publicly announced in full, and never written into a single formal international treaty. And right now, that arrangement is under more pressure than it has been in decades.
Welcome to the long game of wealth, where history reveals how money, power, and time create real wealth.
To understand how we got here, you have to go back to one very uncomfortable Sunday evening. August 15th, 1971. President Nixon appears on television and tells the American public, with very little warning, that the United States is suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Just like that, the central framework that had governed global finance since the Second World War was breaking down. Here's why that mattered so much. After World War II, the major economies had agreed on a system at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Under that system, every major currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. The idea was stability. If you held dollars, you were effectively holding a claim on American gold, and that gave the world a reason to trust the currency. But by the late 1960s, the US was running out of room. The Vietnam War was expensive. The Great Society domestic programs were expensive. America was spending far more than it was earning, and as foreign governments started demanding gold in exchange for their dollars, the reserves began draining fast. So Nixon made a unilateral decision. He closed the gold window. No more convertibility. The dollar was now backed by fiat and confidence, rather than gold. And here is where it gets interesting, because that should have been catastrophic. When you remove the backing from a currency, the rational response is to stop trusting it. Countries should have diversified away from dollars immediately. And yet, the opposite happened. The dollar's dominance actually increased in the decades that followed. Why? Because within just a few years of Nixon's announcement, US officials had helped engineer something to replace gold. Something, in practice, even more powerful. The man most often associated with this shift was Henry Kissinger. In 1974, the United States moved to deepen its strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia through security cooperation, arms sales, and economic coordination. In the years that followed, Saudi oil sales continued to be priced in dollars, and Saudi surpluses were increasingly recycled into dollar assets, including US treasuries. Other major oil exporters also continued to transact overwhelmingly in dollars. Think about what this actually created. Oil is not optional. It powers every economy on Earth. It goes into the fertilizer that grows food, the plastics and everyday products, the fuel that moves goods across oceans. If you need oil, and every country does, you need access to dollars, because the global oil market has overwhelmingly run on that currency. And that means central banks around the world have had strong incentives to hold dollars, not because they like the United States, and not because they trust American politics, but because the global energy market has long been deeply dollarized. This is what economists call the exorbitant privilege. And it is genuinely extraordinary when you sit with it. The United States can print dollars, use them to import real goods from real countries, and those countries will largely accept this arrangement because they need the dollars anyway to buy energy. America has effectively been running a tab at the global bar for 50 years, and the bar keeps accepting the card because the card is the one most widely accepted at the petrol station next door. The numbers that have built up as a result of this are almost surreal. The US last ran an annual goods and services trade surplus in 1975. In 2024 alone, that deficit came in at about $918 billion. At the end of 2024, the US net international investment position stood at roughly negative $26.23 trillion. and yet the dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency, still making up about 57.8% of allocated global foreign exchange reserves. For ordinary Americans, this has functioned as an enormous invisible subsidy. Cheap imports, lower borrowing costs, and a standard of living supported, in part, by sustained global demand for dollar assets. But here's the other side of that deal. It has given a small group of energy exporters in the Gulf an outsized degree of leverage over the global monetary system. And increasingly, that system is no longer operating without challenge. The cracks began appearing long before any recent military conflict. China and Russia increasingly expanded non-dollar settlement in their energy trade, and by 2023, Reuters reported that nearly all of China's oil imports from Russia were being settled in yuan. In 2018, China launched its own crude oil futures contract priced in yuan, specifically designed as an alternative settlement mechanism. Saudi Arabia has also shown greater openness to yuan-based energy trade with China, even if such a shift remains limited for now. And this matters enormously, because the petrodollar system is not a law of physics. It is a convention. And conventions only hold as long as enough powerful actors believe it is in their interest to maintain them. The moment a credible alternative emerges and a large enough coalition decides to use it, the feedback loop can run in reverse just as powerfully as it once ran forward. Consider what unwinding actually looks like in practice. If oil trade gradually migrates to yuan or to a basket of currencies, global demand for dollars could fall. Central banks around the world could begin to hold fewer of them in their reserves. That reduction in demand could make it harder for the US to borrow as cheaply as it has in the past. And remember, total US public debt is now around $39 trillion, not $35 trillion. Even a modest rise in borrowing costs adds enormous pressure to federal interest payments. That money has to come from somewhere, from cuts to spending, from tax increases, or from more borrowing. This is the trap. The US has spent 5 decades benefiting from the petrodollar era, which has allowed it to accumulate a level of debt that would be far more destabilizing for a country without reserve currency status. But that status now rests on relationships and habits that are no longer as unquestioned as they once were. And the frustration runs in both directions. The Gulf states accepted this arrangement because America offered something genuinely valuable in return, namely, protection. But that protection has looked less absolute over time. In 2019, attacks on Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais knocked out about 5% of global oil supply. The United States blamed Iran, though Tehran denied responsibility. Washington offered support, but the episode sharpened Gulf doubts about how far U.S. security guarantees would really go. Now factor in the longer arc of what China has built. In 2000, China accounted for roughly 4% of global trade. By 2024, that figure was around 14%. Beijing is Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. China has also signed currency swap agreements with countries in the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, making non-dollar trade more feasible. And unlike Washington, Beijing has generally not conditioned its partnerships on human rights or governance demands in the same way. For autocratic governments trying to preserve regime stability, that matters. None of this means the dollar collapses tomorrow. The architecture of the global financial system is deeply embedded and slow to change. Trillions of dollars in contracts, debt instruments, and reserve holdings do not reorganize overnight. But financial history is littered with examples of systems that looked permanent, right up until the moment they weren't. The British pound was the world's dominant reserve currency for the better part of 2 centuries. It survived wars, revolutions, and economic crises. But when British imperial power receded after the Second World War, the pound's role receded with it. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a gradual erosion over roughly 2 decades, as global trade reoriented around America, and the logic of holding pounds simply became less compelling. By 1976, Britain was borrowing from the International Monetary Fund to help stabilize a sterling crisis. The lesson is not that reserve currencies disappear suddenly. The lesson is that the process is invisible until it is undeniable. And there is a profound irony sitting at the center of this story. The petrodollar system was built in the 1970s to solve a crisis of American overreach. Nixon had spent too much, printed too much, and the gold-based system buckled under the weight of it. The strategic response was brilliant, but it also planted the seed of the next crisis. Because it allowed the same dynamic, spending beyond your means and exporting the consequences, to continue for another 50 years, at a scale that now dwarfs anything Nixon ever contemplated. The gold window closed in 1971 because America's commitments had outrun its monetary constraints. The question worth sitting with today is whether the same logic is now applying to the petrodollar era itself. Whether American commitments, military, financial, geopolitical, have once again outrun the system that has been underwriting them. The Gulf states did not build their leverage by accident. They built it slowly, over 5 decades, by being indispensable. And indispensability, it turns out, is its own kind of power. One that does not require armies or nuclear weapons. One that operates quietly, through bond markets and oil contracts and currency arrangements, right up until the moment it doesn't. So the next time someone tells you that the dollar is safe because America has the strongest military on earth, it is worth remembering that the dollar's actual foundation has never been military alone. It has been a broader system of trade, finance, and strategic alignment. And systems like that only hold for as long as the major players still want them to. Right now, some of those players are clearly exploring their options. The biggest factual fixes were around the Saudi arrangement being more complex than a single explicit treaty, the Russia-China settlement timeline, the 2024 trade deficit, the reserve share figure, and U.S. debt being closer to $39 trillion now.